Hello. So I want to talk about an issue which I feel is impossible to avoid. Um, and I really wish this wasn't an issue, but like I say, it really is impossible to avoid, and that is the gender debate. Not that there is a single debate, but I'm using the umbrella term because I can't think of any other way to sum it up. Um, when there is international events like International Women's Day. And there is an International Men's Day as well, that has to be said, on November the 19th, I believe it is, and that's very, very good. I really welcome that. That's why I have no issue with International Women's Day, because there is an equilibrium there. But it is pretty much impossible to avoid the gender debate, because the media bombards us with this on an absolutely constant basis. You literally cannot go a day past a day without some article or opinion or report that has something to do with gender equality issues. Now, I do believe that it is important to discuss these things, but sometimes I feel really despairing and sad of the fact that this can be so polarizing. And I believe that some certain lobby groups, certain movements have to take a good deal of responsibility for making it so polarizing. I make no secret of the fact that I have been a long-standing critic of third wave feminism, and I've made a lot of videos which exemplify that, exemplify my positions on the subject. But I would feel really uneasy if people took that to mean that I am opposed to women's rights or that I am somehow anti-women. It actually that saddens me that people could think that, because I really get on well with women, generally speaking, and the reason I am so critical of feminism is because, in its current form, is because I believe it is such a divisive movement. And like any divisive movement, it basically is based on distortion. It's based on very cynically but very surely stirring up animosity towards the other. Just the way far right groups blame all a country's problems on immigrants. In my opinion, feminism blames all the problems women face on men. I believe it is a deeply divisive movement in its current form. But I don't believe that all women or all men for that matter, who identify themselves as feminists are unpleasant, nasty, divisive people. But I really staunchly believe that this creates animosity among human beings that is puts us in a position where you can't even have civil dialogue without shouting at each other. Now, to be fair, there has been a counter movement as well, which is masculism. And the reason I don't call myself a masculist is because I believe certain MRA groups are just as divisive and polarizing. So, what I want to talk about in this video is the absolute necessity of some sort of third way movement, a movement that seeks to bring men and women together to address issues that impact men and women. In other words, there needs to be some sort of consensus that yes, there is issues that impact women, and yes, there is issues that impact men. And for goodness sake, as human beings, let's get together. Now, in my opinion, third wave feminism and more aggressive forms of masculism are both deeply polarizing movements. They're both based on a victimhood mentality. They're both based on stirring up animosity towards anyone who disagrees. And they're both fundamentally very divisive movements, because they don't see people as people, but they see people as solely identified by their gender. The whole world outlook is about he and she. It's not about individual human beings. That to me is extremely dangerous. And that sort of thinking will get us nowhere. I actually administer a group on Facebook, and if you come across it, please do join it. Show its support. The title of my group is Men and Women United as People. And the point I'm trying to get across with that group is that whilst there are certainly issues that disproportionately impact one gender or the other, it doesn't mean that men and women can't work together. And my problem with gender specific movements in the way that they are today is that they really are polarizing. Now, people will say, oh, but you're not neutral, you focus a lot more on feminism. Well, the only reason for that is because feminism is a lot more vocal, it's a lot more obvious. MRA groups and masculinist groups simply aren't as visible as feminists. So when it comes specifically to feminist groups and masculinist groups are the underdog. That's the only reason I don't focus on them more. If they were a lot more apparent, I would certainly be making videos and saying, well, I don't agree with the approach that they're using. And I don't agree with it actually, because certain MRA groups churn out some of the same nonsense that feminists churn out, which is based on outright distortion. There are MRA groups, for example, that will try to say that rape never happens and stuff like this. That sort of thing, all it does is polarize people. Likewise, um, when you get violent, aggressive, obnoxious behavior from certain feminist groups, and supposedly mainstream feminists don't disavow that, that's problematic. For me, one of the main problems here is that you cannot even engage in civil discourse, in civil discussion, if the other person is always going to assume a mantle of automatic victimhood. In other words, if someone like me, who's very critical of feminism, wants to get into a civil discussion with person, a woman who identifies herself as a feminist, it would be very difficult because she will automatically assume that everything I'm saying is an attack on her as a woman. And it wouldn't be that. It would be a critique of her positions as a feminist, not an attack on her as a woman. And that's the problem. When people start to pigeonhole themselves as a feminist or as a masculist, the whole world outlook is about gender, and they're seemingly to me incapable of getting beyond that because anyone who disagrees is automatically the enemy. So it reduces otherwise intelligent people to being incredibly narrow minded. And that's not to say this is the case with everyone, but I really do think it is quite prevalent. Um, the fact of the matter is, the majority of women do not call themselves feminists, and the majority of men would not call themselves masculists. And there is a reason for this. Because the majority of women and the majority of men realize that on a daily basis, they need to interact with one another. As men, I'm a man, and I believe that as men, we have a responsibility to acknowledge that there are issues that impact women disproportionately in this world. There are. And we have a human responsibility to speak out for women's rights. We do. But there should be no shame or stigma in men speaking out for men's rights. That doesn't mean that he hates women. Likewise, a woman has a responsibility to acknowledge that there are issues that disproportionately impact men. But there's nothing wrong with her speaking out on issues that disproportionately impact women. The point I'm making is we really need to get away from this idea that it's all black and white. And I'm speaking here specifically from the context of Western countries. The reason I'm saying that is because I do believe that there are blatant gender differences in certain parts of the world that are so glaringly obvious and so problematic that there is really a need for a gender specific movement. But I believe in Western countries where I would argue the issues that impact men and women are roughly the same. Um, Give an example. You can say, for instance, that far too many female victims of rape don't get the justice they deserve. Hence, that's something that disproportionately impacts women. On the other hand, you could say that there is a disproportionate number of homeless people who are male. Now, that's irrefutable. Doesn't mean that there isn't homeless women, there is, but it does disproportionately impact men. Suicide disproportionately impacts men. Then there's other issues that disproportionately impact women. So we need to, in my opinion, people need to really be wary about movements that are seeking to promote a victimhood mentality for only one gender, because ultimately that is divisive. It just is. That's why I was so critical of Jess Phillips, the MP, because I believe that is the sort of thinking that only goes to divide men and women. And I would just be just as wary about, for example, Fathers for Justice. Some of their tactics, I believe, is just as polarizing. So there needs to be a third way that really, really seeks to address issues that both genders face. There are certain neutral issues um, that both genders face, and that's it's important to address that. But what I'm talking about is when there is a particular issue that impacts women more or it impacts men more. As people, we need to acknowledge that and work with it. But there is legitimate criticism of movements that only seek to divide. Now, let's just be honest about it. Feminism is not an inclusive movement. It's not. The track record in recent years shows that because leading feminists have shamed other women who don't call themselves feminist. That's not inclusive. And automatically saying that a man must be a sexist dinosaur if he doesn't support feminism is not inclusive. It's just not. You don't win arguments by putting people down in that way. Likewise, masculists have to realize that feeling that the whole of womankind is their enemy is not going to get them anywhere. And I have seen certain MRA groups basically dismiss all women as the problem. That is clearly wrong. So there has to be a third way. That's not that's not weak language. That is something to me that is complete and utter common sense. Because in the end of the day, unless you believe in segregation, men and women interact with each other on a daily basis. We have to support each other as human beings. We have to have compassion. What is wrong with that? And I just think that when you're constantly saying that we are the victim, but the other side is always privileged, that's not going to get any campaign anywhere. All it's going to do is stir up resentment, stir up fear, stir up hostility. That's what it does. And that is irrefutable. I mean, if that wasn't the case, why is it whenever there is a report about anything to do with sexism or gender equality issues, if you look at the comments below, they're always very, very cynical? Now, there's a reason for that. It's because there is a widespread perception among men and women that there is divisive forces out there. So, for goodness sake, if you're a feminist, reach out to men. If you're a masculist, reach out to women. Don't polarize the other side. It just doesn't work. As a man, I have a lot of affection for women. And I'm not just saying that to sound good. I really, really do. That's why I find this situation so sad. Because ultimately, we're all human beings. So I really, really call for a third way. For my part, I'm going to try and make less videos about feminism, not because I don't believe in what I've said, but because I don't want to give the impression that I I'm obsessed by that, or I don't believe that there aren't issues impacting women. I know there are. And I am a bit concerned that maybe I've sent out the message that I am, opposed to women's rights or something. It just so far from the truth. The reason I'm calling for this third way approach is because I believe it is absolutely essential. So this video is not intended as an attack. Or if you're a feminist or you're a masculist, I'm not attacking you, but I am attacking and criticizing the more polarizing aspects of your respective movements. And you need to speak candidly, you need to wake up and realize that there are deeply polarizing aspects. There are. So, for goodness sake, as human beings, let's reach out to people. And a final thing I want to say, I am not saying that all feminists or all masculists are always negative. I'm not saying that. But I believe it overwhelmingly is, because it is overwhelmingly about victimhood. And I think that is quite obvious.